Well, hello. Welcome to Life Point. This is week 3 in our series, Toxic. And the last couple weeks, you guys have talked about everything from toxic thoughts, toxic influences. And this week, we're looking at something that's a little bit more close to home and close to our own hearts and lives, and that is toxic relationships. This morning, we looked at different types of toxic people. So we looked at the toxic person that we call the chronically negative and how they're just constantly down on stuff. They're gossiping. They just bring you down. They're very toxic to have in your life. And then we talked about the controller. This controller wants to control every bit about your life. They're manipulative. They're going to use fear to control the different aspects of your life. They may even use abuse. Again, very toxic. And then we looked at the tempter, the person that's pushing you or tempting you to do things you know you shouldn't do, regardless if it's a dirty sin or whether it's something like materialism or stuff that maybe our culture doesn't view bad, but regardless, they tempt you to behave in a way that you know you shouldn't. So we looked at this, but we also looked at the example in the scripture where Paul talks about how bad company corrupts good character. Now, it's interesting in this verse because he leads off by saying, do not be deceived. In other words, we deceive ourselves. We listen to all these other things. We try to justify relationships with others. Okay, don't be misled. Don't be deceived. If there's a toxic relationship, you need to deal with it. And then we looked at another example where Paul's looking at an unhealthy relationship that's in one of the churches. And he's giving Timothy advice on how to deal with it. And he said, you know what? If you're indulging in this type of behavior, if you're allowing it to happen around you, you're going to become more and more ungodly. And it's like gangrene. We looked at a few pictures of gangrene. You don't have to do that in your life point tonight. I'm going to spare you, but it's nasty stuff that if it's not treated, it spreads and it brings death. Like literally your flesh dies. It's nasty, horrible stuff. And that's what can happen when we're surrounding ourselves and indulging in toxic relationships. So what do you got to do about it? There's 2 things that you need to do. Set healthy boundaries or cut it off. The first thing, most important thing, where you always start with is healthy boundaries. We could go on with example after example after example, but it really boils down to this. You need to say, don't talk to me like that, or don't treat me like that, or I'm not going there with you. Okay? Whatever the situation may be, draw a line. Be clear about it. Do it in love, but draw a line. I'm not going there with you. Don't talk that way around me, or don't treat me like that. Second thing, when we look at cutting off a relationship, that's hard. It really is because we care about people that we have relationships with. But if it's come to a point where they ignore boundary after boundary after boundary, and they're just bringing these toxic influences into your life, there comes a point where you've got to cut it off. Not marriages, not family relationships. We're talking about general relationships that you have. It's difficult. We see this with Paul and Barnabas. They split ways over disagreement, but they were both effective. They didn't let the toxicity ruin what God had called them to do. They just went their separate ways. There could be so many examples where you may need to cut something off, as painful as it is. But you know what? You could be surprised what God does in you, what God does in the other person that you cut off, because you were willing to establish your boundaries and then enforce it with a cutoff. But in your life point tonight, you have a lot of questions from your leader. As you guys talk through this, keep this in mind, that when we have toxic relationships, it builds us down, tears us down. When we have healthy relationships, it builds us up. What can you do to make sure that you're healthy enough to show God's love in a toxic world? Thanks for joining us at Life Points. We'll see you next week.